I'm Margaret Levy, and I'm director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and a former president of APSA. And most importantly, I'm a friend of Kathy Thelen. And she has asked me, to my great honor, to introduce her tonight. It is a really great pleasure to introduce the 113th president, if I counted right, of the, did I count right, Steve? Of the American Political Science Association, and its 10th female president. This last designation is significant given that Kathy herself has for so long demonstrated a strong commitment to the promotion of women in the discipline for their scholarship, their publications, and their office holding. More importantly, she does this by recognizing the contributions of all genders to the profession while acknowledging the unique strengths and obstacles each confronts. Her presidential task force reflects on the career paths of women in order to ensure their advancement in the profession. The combination of commitment, clear thinking, and even-handedness is equally evident in her extraordinary body of research. She is one of the founders and leading lights in what has become comparative historical institutionalism, and she takes every word in that label seriously. An assiduous investigator, she leaves no stone unturned and no method untried in order to ascertain how the world actually works. Nor is she, or has she ever been, afraid to take on the big guns, but she does so by sorting through the facts and arguments, staying calm in the face of academic versions of screaming matches among adversaries, and then offering a perspective that both synthesizes and advances knowledge. The result is that she fundamentally changes the conversation. These qualities are apparent throughout her opus, but particularly evident in her 2014 Varieties of Liberalization and the New Politics of Social Solidarity. I just reread the intro, which is just a model of this kind of way of thinking and acting. Her interest in labor unions was what first brought Kathy to my attention. I'm older than Kathy. Given my own engagement with issues of work and workers. But it was her 1995 piece with Richard Locke, Apples and Oranges Revisited, Contextualized Comparisons and the Study of Comparative Labor Politics, that appeared in Politics and Society that really made me sit up and take notice of both her and Ricky. I don't know if Ricky's here. But they combined their shared substantive interest in workers' association with a sophisticated grasp of the importance of doing comparisons, but doing them well. This is another theme that continues throughout Kathy's work up until this day. It is one of the reasons she is now, with Eric Wibbles, the co-general editor of Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics. Kathy's honors and awards are already numerous and will, I can confidently predict, continue to amass. I could go through all of Kathy's notable achievements and contributions to research, but I would repeating, and not as well, the beautifully crafted essay, Shift Happens, that James Mahoney wrote for PS upon Kathy's selection as APSA president. All should read that if you haven't already. What I can add to her story are my own personal experiences with Kathy. I was her predecessor at Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics and oversaw both the recent book as well as her Woodrow Wilson award-winning How Institutions Evolve, a truly masterful book, and her two edited books with James Mahoney. I was the editor of Politics and Society when she published her two articles there. I remember her glee when she reported her use of game theory in one of those pieces. Indeed, she was among the first to recognize when it would be useful and when not to meld the new economic institutionalism with historical institutionalism. That move appears in the most cited piece ever for Annual Review of Political Science, her fabulous Historical Institutionalism and Comparative Politics. And I'm very proud to say that I solicited and shepherded that article for ARPS. So now you know why I'm up here. What I have learned is what all of us learn who have close dealings with Kathy. She is a brilliant and self-confident scholar who demands, indeed welcomes, critical input that will make her writing and thinking even better. She is always kind, always gracious, But she never stops learning, and she never stops requiring the best from herself and from those she respects. I have watched Kathleen Thelen evolve, a word I know she loves, from a talented assistant professor to a world-famous scholar and academic leader, applauded and appreciated internationally. She continues to lead the way in scholarship on advanced capitalist societies and their varieties of transformation. We're going to hear tonight about her next steps in this important lifelong project. Kathy, thank you for being my colleague. We look forward to continuing to learn from you. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. That was an incredibly generous introduction. So the theme of our conference this year is democracy and its discontents. And I decided that the way that I might be able to contribute to that conversation might be to try to sort of shine a light on some of the features of our own democracy, or my own democracy, that I think don't receive the attention that they're due from political scientists. So as you know, I'm a student of the political economy of the rich democracies, and from my perspective, one of the kind of casualties of the way that we've sort of drawn lines around the subfields in our discipline is that it seems to have sort of sidelined the study of the American political economy, by which I mean the study of American capitalism. This is a topic that, over the course of my career at least, has mostly sort of fallen between the cracks. Scholars like me who study capitalism in the rich democracies, we tend to focus on Europe. I think for normative reasons, we're sort of drawn to places like Sweden and Denmark and Norway, which of course have their problems, but where we can still sort of point to the possibility, at least, of combining successful economic performance with relatively high levels of economic equality. Students of American politics, for their part, have of course given us extremely important insights, particularly into what I think of as the behavioral foundations of American politics, focusing especially on voting behavior and public opinion and so on. But it's pretty rare, actually rare in the extreme, for Americanists to compare the US to other countries. And more important for the topic that I want to talk about today, the issues and the actors that figure so centrally in the study of other rich democracies, unions, finance, organized business, they don't really figure at all in the mainstream literature on American politics. So in the meantime, of course, we do have some important studies, especially of high-end inequality, the famous 1% or the role of moneyed interests in American politics, thanks, I'm sure, not least to some of the people in this room. But my emphasis today is going to be a little different in that I want to focus not on high-end inequality, but instead on the kind of normal, taken-for-granted operation of markets. In particular labor markets, and especially at the low end of the income ladder. So what I want to do today is see what we can learn about American capitalism, and by extension, I think, about American democracy, by situating the US in a broader comparative perspective. I'm going to start with something that we're hearing a lot about these days, which is the emergence of the so-called gig economy. This is a term that, as you know, comes out of the entertainment industry, where musicians don't really have jobs. They perform these gigs it's sort of jobs on a pickup basis, these one-off gigs. But what the term now refers to is a phenomenon in which, instead of being employed in the usual way on some sort of normal employment contract, people are increasingly getting paid to perform individual tasks, like deliver your food, or drive you around, or walk your dog. And even if you're not familiar with that particular term, I'm guessing you recognize at least some of the companies on this slide. I'm sure many of you have an Uber or a Lyft app on your phone. I'm sure some of you have probably stayed at an Airbnb on vacation with your family at some point or another. And I know for sure that many of my colleagues and graduate students are running their surveys through Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is an online marketplace for digital piecework, and where, as suggested on the screen, these Turkers, as they're called, can go online, find an interesting task like filling out your survey, and make money. Now, if you've used any of these new services, you know that this gig economy has been pretty great for consumers. Okay? Users are getting a service that's tailored to exactly what they need, when they need it, and typically it's very inexpensive, of course, because workers are only getting paid for the particular task that they're performing. Of course, gig work can also be a great thing for workers, or at least some workers. For example, if you have highly marketable skills, say software skills, this kind of freelancing can be pretty liberating. Suddenly you can organize your time however you want. It can also be great for parents, especially women, who often, of course, bear primary responsibility for children, and for whom it may be pretty convenient to be able to work flexibly, maybe even from home. However, it turns out that for everyone who benefits from the flexibility that this new type of work offers, there are also those who are pressed into this type of employment either for lack of alternatives or, especially these days, to supplement insufficient pay from some other job. So a recent study by the Pew Research Center revealed that over half of Americans who earned money for one of these digital labor platforms indicated that this work was either essential or important to making ends meet. And it turns out that for people who really do depend on these platforms, it's not actually so easy to make a living. For example, contrary to the picture that you just saw of the woman holding all the $100 bills, it turns out that the hourly earnings of American Turkers are very well below the federal minimum wage. It's also not just low wages, it's also that current laws treat these Uber drivers, these Turkers, not as employees, but as independent contractors, which means that they don't have any of the rights and benefits attached to a regular job. Okay, so no minimum wage, no overtime rules, no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation if you get hurt on the job. On all those fronts, you're on your own. So in this talk, I want to situate the rise of this new type of gig work in the context of a longer-term and much broader phenomenon, namely the rise of what the French scholar Robert Castel called the new precariat. I define the precariat, as Castel did, as flowing from a growing fragmentation of work and the breakdown of the standard employment relationship, by which I mean stable, long-term employment contracts with benefits and regular, predictable hours. So this is a trend that's common across all of the advanced industrial countries, and it's resulted in what Jacob Hacker has called a privatization of risk, as more and more economic risks are shifted from employers and from governments onto the shoulders of workers themselves. In my remarks, I'm going to focus primarily on the impact of these trends among low-skill, low-income groups, because they're the ones who, in many ways, experience precarity most intensely. But it's important to be clear that precarity is not the same as poverty, and it doesn't only hit low-skill workers. It also hits highly educated groups. And just to emphasize this point, have a look at trends in our own discipline. So this graph shows that the academic labor force has grown really massively since the 1970s. But what it also shows is that non-tenure line positions, adjuncts, lecturers, have grown much faster than tenure line positions, which means that the profile of our profession is now predominantly highly skilled, but contingent in the sense of employed on an as-needed basis, which of course can be very predictable and very unstable. So this substitution, this swapping out of more flexible, more contingent forms of employment in place of previously more secure jobs affects a lot of different sectors. And that means that precarity at least in the way that I'm going to be using it today, extends well beyond just those gig workers that I was talking about at the outset. So in exploring these issues, I'm going to be pushing back a little bit against the kind of self-congratulatory rhetoric that we're hearing these days. All this talk of record low levels of unemployment, of all this robust job creation. And along the way, I hope also to shed some light on one of the more puzzling features of the American labor market, which is reflected in many of the headlines and graphs that we've been seeing over the course of the summer, namely continued real wage stagnation despite now 8 years of steadily declining unemployment. So the question for me is not how many jobs did the US economy generate last month or even last year, but what kinds of jobs are these? And in some cases, how many of these jobs do you have to hold at the low end in order to make ends meet? The rest of my talk then proceeds in 5 steps. First, I want to look into some of the forces that are driving the growth of various sorts of atypical work arrangements. Second, I want to discuss why these developments pose a problem, both at the individual level and at the national level. Third, I want to situate the US in a comparative perspective to show that while these trends are pervasive across all the rich democracies, the problem of precarity presents itself especially acutely in this country. Fourth, I want to zero in on one of the features of the American political economy that I think plays a very central role in exacerbating the problem of precarity and in intensifying the effects in this country. And fifth and finally, I'm going to kind of circle back to address the way in which the study of American capitalism relates to the theme of this conference on democracy and what we as political scientists might do about it. So the most common forms of so-called atypical employment travel under different names in different national or sectoral contexts. They're called mini-jobs, bogus self-employment, on-demand work, so-called zero-hours contracts, whatever that could be, and many more. But the general point is that the new reality for a growing number of people is employment that is less steady, it's less secure, and above all, it's less well embedded in traditional social protections. Now, non-standard employment is, of course, nothing new. Historically speaking, of course, the standard employment relationship is actually the exception. Particularly in the early industrial period, all work was casual, which is to say insecure and irregular. And of course, in many parts of the developing world, that's still very much the case. So early labor market reformers in Europe, including Fabian socialists like Beatrice Webb, who's pictured here, of course fought against this. But I have to say there were also conservatives who saw this as a problem, either because they were, terrified of a revolution, or often because they simply thought that it was a pretty inefficient way to run a labor market. In any event, with the rise of organized labor, the trend historically, at least in the rich democracies, was toward decasualization, so that by the mid-20th century, the norm of stable, full-time work attached to a package of benefits had become quite entrenched. So the model mid-century industrial firm embodied what the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson described as a nexus of reciprocal relationships. Okay, this was a model that concentrated power in the hands of managers, but these were managers whose goal was stable, long-term growth. It was underwritten by so-called patient capital. In Europe, this was often provided by banks. In the United States, more typically by passive or dispersed shareholders. But either way, this allowed for the cultivation of long-term relationships and stable gains for all of the company's stakeholders, including, of course, labor. However, as especially the sociologist Jerry Davis has pointed out, many of today's largest and most dynamic companies don't really conform to this model. Instead, firms have become increasingly fragmented, or as David Weil has put it, fissured, as companies construct extensive networks of subcontracting and franchising that allow them to outsource all kinds of operations. In other words, using cheaper third-party suppliers of all sorts of goods and services in order to cut costs, particularly labor costs. So instead of being directly employed by the big core firm, the GM, workers are now more likely than before to be working either independently as one of these independent contractors, or to be working on less generous, more flexible terms for some smaller entity in a sort of loose network of subcontractors or branch operations that are all formally independent from one another, but that are all actually part of a bigger hierarchy in the service of the core company. Now, those strategies are by no means unknown in manufacturing. Actually, in the meantime, they're pretty widespread. But where atypical work has really flourished is in labor-intensive services like the ones on the screen, especially the retail and hospitality industries, where changes in technology now really allow employers to adjust their staffing levels to match consumer demand more or less in real time. In this context, these digital platforms like Uber, Upwork, Mechanical Turk, they've simply elevated these strategies to a new level by foregoing the employment contract altogether and using these independent contractors instead, where the firm bears no responsibility for wages, for benefits, for hours, or anything else. The core logic and the implications of these trends were, I think, especially well summarized by the CEO of a major crowdsourcing platform in a moment of, I would say, unscripted candor. He said, before the internet, it would be really difficult to find someone, sit them down for 10 minutes and get them to work for you, and then fire them after those 10 minutes. But with technology, you can actually find them, pay them a tiny amount of money, and then get rid of them when you don't need them anymore. So obviously, he's just being shockingly candid about it, but I want to emphasize again that it's not just these platform businesses that have embraced this logic. The upshot of the strategies of firms in the sectors that I've been talking about and others is that they're increasingly abdicating the responsibilities once attached to the standard employment relationship. So why is this a problem? Or is it even a problem? For some people, as I mentioned, it's actually not a problem. It's a big plus if you're doing this kind of thing just for fun, or if you're doing it on the side, if you have health care or Social Security from some other job. But for people who depend on these more flexible jobs for their livelihood, these developments have often translated into an extremely harsh form of precarity as they face either recurring unemployment or often chronic underemployment. So this is a graph from the dissertation of one of my former graduate students, James Conran, which tracks the evolution of average weekly working hours for employed men, okay, this is men who have jobs, in the top and bottom income quartiles in the US going back to 1980. So the top earners are the solid line and the low earners are the dashed line. And what you see here is that the number of hours worked by those in this top income bracket rose in the 1980s and has stayed pretty steady since. But the really striking development here is the hours of men in the lowest income group, which drops off. There's the first big drop in the early 1980s, and then you have another very large drop after the financial crisis. Okay, this is part of what Conran calls the Great Reversal, where those at the top of the income ladder, what we used to think of as the leisure class, they're now working longer and longer hours, while low-wage workers are often suffering chronic underemployment. Underemployment often takes the form of involuntary part-time work. That's people who are working part-time jobs when they would actually prefer to be working full-time. This is something that's highly cyclical for all groups, but which in the United States always hits women and people of color especially hard. Underemployment can also take the form of insufficient or unstable hours even in full-time work. And if you want to know what that looks like in real life, you should just talk to some of the folks who are taking care of us in Boston and at this conference. You can talk to some of the folks in these airport food kiosks that work late at night when you're flying in and out. You can talk to people who are bussing the tables or washing the dishes at Boston's wonderful restaurants. Or you could talk to some of the folks cleaning your hotel room while you attend your panel. These new forms of insecurity often take the form of recurring unemployment between jobs that offer no or low employment protection. So for a bit of a comparative perspective, this slide compares the US to several other countries based on an OECD measure of labor market insecurity. And without going into the details of the index, it's basically a composite measure based on three things: the risk of becoming unemployed, the expected duration of unemployment, and the degree to which unemployment benefits are going to fill the gap. And this is disaggregated by skill level, with high skill in orange and low skill in blue. As you'd expect, low-skilled workers are experiencing higher levels of labor market insecurity, though what I want you also to recognize or notice that in some countries, in this slide, Belgium and Denmark, social policies are mitigating that gap, reducing the level of labor market insecurity among low-skilled workers to levels that aren't that different from those of high-skilled workers. The US is obviously in the lower right-hand corner, and I think it stands out both for the comparatively high level of labor market insecurity among low-skilled workers generally, but also for the size of the gap that separates them from high-skilled workers on this scale. What's also clear is that, especially for people who aren't choosing these kinds of jobs, all this employment flexibility isn't really a two-way deal. Employers in sectors like retail and food services can use new technologies to optimize scheduling, in extreme cases calling workers in or off on very short notice. So this slide is based on a survey of low-skill service employees in Washington, D.C. The graph on the left shows how far in advance their work schedules are getting posted. So blue is less than 3 days in advance, and orange is less than a week in advance. And so what you're seeing on the left is that for close to 50% of the people in this survey, they were getting a week or less notice for when they'd be expected to show up for work. If that weren't enough, on the right you see even after the initial posting, often further changes were made so that some of these workers are getting less than 24 hours notice. That's the bit indicated in blue. So this all obviously makes it extremely hard to budget. It's really hard to arrange daycare. It's hard to pursue any kind of education. It's even actually hard to work a second job. So basically what you're getting is a new polarization between those who are able to make use of these new, more flexible arrangements to gain autonomy because their social position is anyway secure, and those, on the other hand, who experience all this flexibility simply as a lack of attachments, as a lack of protections. And the demographics of those two groups are, of course, radically different, with women and people of color much more heavily concentrated in those sectors in which flexibility only really works for the employers. How big is the precarity problem? Precarity is very tough to measure. These days, we tend to think about the health of the labor market in terms of unemployment. And again, we're hearing a lot about these record low levels of unemployment. But just looking at unemployment doesn't tell us much about precarity if you have people moving in and out of jobs, or people working more than one job, or people employed in jobs that don't provide social protections or even maybe a living wage. So we have to look beyond employment figures or unemployment figures. In Europe, the main measure, or a main measure, that people rely on when they want to talk about precarity is to track the growth of temporary employment contracts of various sorts. And the reason that people focus on this in Europe is because their workers on these temporary contracts don't enjoy the same strong employment protections as people on regular contracts. So one thing that's been happening in Europe is that governments have been relaxing the restrictions on the use of these temporary contracts. And that's what you see in this graph. The OECD developed an index of the strictness of employment protection, and again, without going into all the details of how they measure this, basically it has to do with notification and consultation requirements, including whether or not some labor representative has to be notified or consulted to let workers go. You don't have to know the ins and outs. For now, all you need to know is that the bigger the number, the stronger the level of employment protection, or put differently, the more restrictions there are on employers. And this is broken out for people who are on regular contracts and people who are on temporary contracts. And so here what you're seeing is that the rules governing these temporary contracts, the light blue line, they're getting loosened, while also, interestingly, many of the protections for workers on regular contracts are left in place. So that's Europe. But here's the figures for the US. And they make clear that the big story here is that nobody really has any employment protection. They never really did, right? The US is in fact known in comparative circles for the ease with which employers can hire and fire people, even people on regular contracts. This is a function of our unique system of so-called at-will employment that can be traced back to the old Lochner era freedom of contract doctrine. So that when it comes to employment protection legislation, there's a way in which all jobs are in some ways more precarious than in most of Europe. Another way to think about precarity is to compare the package of benefits that are attached to all these jobs that are getting created in the US. Okay, in most European countries, both full-time and part-time workers enjoy a pretty significant package of benefits. They can just count on things like sick pay, vacation pay, parental leave, in some cases, rights to training. This is typically, of course, prorated for part-time workers. But these are things that are just very often unavailable, certainly for the vast majority of part-time workers, but also for large numbers of even full-time workers, particularly those at the low end in the US. And I want you to realize I'm not just talking about the kind of well-known differences like universal health care or things like that in the US count as kind of luxury benefits like paid parental leave or rights to training. I'm talking about very fundamental benefits like sick pay, where the US is the only advanced industrial democracy that has, where workers have no federally guaranteed entitlement to paid days off when they're too sick to come to work. This is not something that's getting better with time. In fact, it's been getting worse, especially for the most vulnerable groups on the labor market. These are data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on access to paid sick leave from 1980 to the present. And where, as you see, the most striking development is in this category of what the BLS calls technical and clerical workers, the light blue line. And this includes precarious workers in some of the low-skill service sectors that I've been talking about. These are occupations that require a high school education or less. For those workers in those occupations, as you see, access to paid sick leave dropped precipitously starting in about the mid-1980s and then really plummeted in the late 1990s. This graph then covers the entire labor market and shows that in this country, the lower your income, the less likely it is that you'll have any access to paid sick leave. And I could repeat this same exercise for a bunch of other benefits as well, healthcare, pensions, you name it. This graph then gives you a comparative perspective on another benefit, rights to paid vacation and paid holidays, and where, as you see, the US is an extreme outlier, lower even than Japan, a country in which so many people die of overwork that they actually have a word for that. Another way to think about precarity is to compare the size of the low-pay sector across different countries. So this figure situates the US in a broad comparative perspective, giving the most recent data on the low-pay sector across the rich democracies. Low pay here defined as the share of the workforce earning less than 2/3 of median earnings. And here we see that, despite all of this employment growth, the US still occupies the top position, or I guess you'd have to say the bottom position, among comparable low OECD countries when it comes to the incidence of low-pay work. Finally, we can assess labor market precarity by examining levels of in-work poverty cross-nationally. Okay? These are people who are working at least one job, but whose jobs don't provide sufficient income to lift them out of poverty. I consider this a kind of measure of underemployment. And here, as you see, the US doesn't occupy the most extreme end of the spectrum, but you may also notice that the US is not in great company. The countries closest to the US, Italy, Greece, Spain, are of course the most troubled in Europe. In Greece and Spain, for example, unemployment is currently at or just below 20%. This problem of in-work poverty is not in the US, is not a marginal phenomenon. It's not a declining phenomenon. It applies to two of the largest and fastest growing occupations in the United States, home health care workers and personal care aides. These are actually the third and fourth fastest growing occupations in the United States currently. So solar installers are growing faster, but there we're talking about tens of thousands of jobs. With home health care workers and personal aides, we're talking about millions of jobs. These are jobs that are disproportionately performed by women, by people of color, often foreign-born, and people with a high school education or less. In that occupation, whether you're full-time or part-time, it actually doesn't matter at all. You almost certainly don't enjoy any of the benefits that I was just talking about that are standard for workers in Europe. Most strikingly, I would say, from a comparative perspective, is that these workers weren't even covered by federal minimum wage or overtime regulations until literally 3 years ago, until an Obama-era rule change, which, by the way, the current administration has been talking about rescinding. So yes, those people are showing up in the jobs figures as employed, but what is also the case is that close to a quarter of these workers are below the official poverty line, and over half of them rely on some form of public assistance. In short, all of the rich democracies have this problem of growing contingency, of growing precarity, but I think it's fair to say that the effects of this are probably most acutely felt among low-income families in the United States. Why might this be the case? Well, here I think a comparative perspective is helpful not just in assessing the extent of precarity, but also in identifying the specific features of the American political economy that contribute to these outcomes. So the most obvious feature is probably the peculiar character of the American welfare state. This one I think I probably don't need to dwell on because it is one area that has received the attention of scholars, at least of American social policy. But the literature in comparative political economy is really rich in insights about a whole range of other institutions that contribute to these outcomes. So with more time, I could talk about how features of the US education system exacerbate precarity, or how trends in corporate governance or finance or even antitrust contribute to these outcomes. But instead, I'm just going to focus on one aspect of the American political economic landscape that I think plays an especially obvious and very direct role in explaining the scope of precarity and the intensity of precarity in the US context, and that's the legal regime governing labor and employment. So any such discussion, of course, begins with labor unions and the rules governing industrial relations. This is a topic that doesn't come up in the mainstream literature in American politics, but in the comparative literature, unions figure very prominently, and for good reason, because unions have been the key protagonists in expanding social protections and reducing inequality. I think it's probably fairly well known that unions are weaker in the US than in almost any other rich democracy, and that's what you're seeing on this graph. This graph just gives some figures on union density, that is, how many people belong to a union. So this is going to confirm what you already knew, namely that the US is close to the bottom. France is actually the one country with a lower level of union membership. But that's not the end of the story. And this becomes clear when we add in data on bargaining coverage. How many people are covered by contracts that unions negotiate, whether or not they themselves belong to a union? And when you do that, you get a pretty different picture. What you see is that while the US is not alone at the low end of the spectrum with respect to union membership, most of the other countries down there with us achieve far higher levels of bargaining coverage. There are different mechanisms through which this happens, through industry-wide bargains, through higher levels of employer organization, through government actions of various sorts. For present purposes, what I really want to emphasize is what this means, especially for low-income workers. And to get a sense of that, we can rely on what I think is a wonderful study by the sociologists Carre and Tilley who compared France and the US, the two countries with the lowest union membership rates, and they focused their analysis on the retail sector. So retail workers are not well organized in any of these countries. It actually turns out that they're a little better organized in the US than they are in France. But the difference is that in France, a large majority of retail workers are anyway covered by the labor contracts because the terms that unions negotiate with the large retailers are carried over to smaller companies whether or not their workforces are unionized. And as a result, the average hourly wages of retail employees in France, as you can see, are much closer to the average hourly wages for the economy as a whole. So the key difference here is obviously not union membership per se. Instead, it goes back to the rules governing industrial relations in the two countries. As anyone who has seen the movie Norma Ray knows, the basic rule in the US, which is very different from Europe, is that in order for workers to gain representation by a union, that union has to win a majority vote in a particular bargaining unit, typically a particular workplace. This turns out to be uncommonly difficult in the US, because while the rules governing industrial relations give workers the right to form unions, they also give employers extraordinarily strong tools to resist unionization, stronger than any other rich democracy that I know of. So the ground rules make it really difficult to begin with. And then on top of that, those recent trends that I was talking about toward fisherization, those trends compound this problem, multiplying exponentially the number of workplaces in which unions would have to mount and succeed in these campaigns. In the US, this is also combined with a second feature that is completely distinctive and that is a direct holdover from the New Deal compromise with the Jim Crow South. And that is that many of the most vulnerable workers, mostly agricultural and domestic workers, are specifically excluded from the protections of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act that governs union organization. So for example, those home health care workers I was just talking about, under prevailing federal law, many of them don't have any rights to collective bargaining. They couldn't form a union even if they wanted to. Domestic workers were also excluded from the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act that was meant to provide some minimum protections on wages and hours for all workers, whether or not they were unionized. As I mentioned, the Obama administration closed that exemption for these home health care workers, or at least those who are, work for agencies, but the vast majority of those workers are still not covered by the usual occupational safety and health protections, nor do they enjoy any kind of guaranteed sick pay or vacation pay. In fact, outside a handful of states, domestic workers as a whole, including not just home-based elder care and other kinds of aides, but housekeepers and nannies, they're still fighting for things like the right to a rest break, or the right to 8 hours of sleep, or the right to basic protections against abuse and sexual harassment, which is rampant in the domestic care industry. I mean, to me, that's the definition of precarity. The other group that's outside the usual system of benefits and explicitly prohibited from organizing under federal labor law are these independent contractors, those gig workers that I was talking about at the beginning. It's not just that they can't form unions to bargain collectively, it's also when they do organize, this is viewed as collusion under existing antitrust law in the US. So the way American antitrust operates, which is very different from Europe, concentrations of market control by firms are not viewed as problematic so long as they don't leave consumers worse off. Okay, and so this has led to the somewhat perverse situation that Uber, which has sort of oligopoly power in local transportation markets, operates unencumbered by antitrust legislation. But when Uber drivers in Seattle sought to organize to bargain collectively with the company, they were the ones who were hit with the antitrust suit that I think that they're still fighting. This example then points to a final consideration in the advance of precarity in the US, and it has to do with the role of consumers. And here I'm going to start to come back to where I started. In a way, consumers are often drawn into complicity in this. Consumers have quite a lot of power in the American context, but the fact of the matter is it's a power that is very rarely wielded on behalf of workers. On the contrary, where, as in the US, there is no organized countervailing power advocating on behalf of workers, where there's nothing pulling in the other direction, American consumers instead often just get enlisted in a kind of implicit or explicit alliance against labor. So sometimes firms cultivate these alliances pretty explicitly. Uber, for example, has of course never been shy about mobilizing its users, enlisting them often through the app itself to support the company in its various battles with politicians and regulators. A lot of times, though, these alliances are a lot more subtle, like rewards programs that carry benefits for consumers and companies, but don't necessarily turn out to be great for workers. Over time, of course, the whole thing becomes kind of self-enforcing, right? Walmart can argue that it has to keep its labor costs low so that it can continue to deliver those everyday low prices to whom? To low-income families. And then there's Amazon, which is hugely popular and which in the meantime completely dominates the online retail market. And by the way, is also pulling the entire retail sector over to its business model, including its labor practices. And what most of us know, but we don't really want to think about all that much, is that what's behind that whole operation, what makes it possible to get those packages delivered so fast and so cheaply are those people who work in these fulfillment centers, whose jobs are pretty brutal. They work at a frantic pace. Their hours fluctuate wildly depending on the season. But, from a consumer perspective, it seems to be kind of irresistibly convenient to get those books or whatever delivered to your door in 2 days flat. So I could give you example after example after example, but the point that I want you to really take away is that the basic problem is pervasive. It is structural, and it has to do with the way in which the institutions of our political economy reward and encourage business models that are organized around reducing labor costs to a bare minimum. And when that translates into the lower prices that consumers crave and that, frankly, the American antitrust regime sanctifies, that is a powerful force. And it's a force that in this country faces very few countervailing forces. A few years ago, my friend Jenny Mansbridge gave her presidential lecture on the need for what she called legitimate coercion in order to solve pressing and socially important collective action problems. She argued that because individually it's often hard to do the right thing, we sometimes have to be kind of forced together to do the right thing. And to me, there is just great need for legitimate coercion on behalf of vulnerable workers in the current period. I'm sorry, that was about the Amazon workers. Much more could be said about how other features of the American political economic landscape contribute to the growth of our precariat. Ours is a precariat that is in some ways so big, so ubiquitous, that we don't even see it. It's kind of hidden in plain sight all around us, including, of course, at this conference. In that context, what comparative analysis can do is to help to make the invisible more visible. Comparative analysis helps us realize why it's probably not okay to make broad generalizations about the wonderful state of our labor market based only on last month's jobs figures. Comparative analysis reveals what an outlier the U.S. is, not just with respect to high-end inequality, which of course we knew, but also with respect to inequality at the low end of the income ladder. And finally, comparative analysis serves, I think, as a powerful and, to me, kind of chilling reminder of the ways in which this country's labor and employment laws in some ways still reflect and even carry forward some of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. In short, comparative analysis helps us see clearly how some of the market outcomes that we take as normal or natural or given are in fact powerfully shaped by policy, by politics, and by political choice. So to conclude, and to return to this year's conference theme, I began this talk by noting that we know quite a lot about the individual level behavioral aspects of American democracy, based on a large number of studies that center on the opinions that Americans hold and the way that they cast their ballots. Public opinion and elections are clearly important, as of course recent developments have shown. However, to me, studies focusing only on those aspects don't really capture the whole of what we mean by democracy. And that's because the equality that we aspire to in this democracy is not just a matter of formal democratic procedures, as important as they are. It's animated as well by substantive ambitions and a sense of what a just society looks like. It turns out that previous students of American politics understood this deeply and pursued it with passion in their scholarship. In two very rarely cited works by one of our discipline's great theorists of democracy, Robert Dahl made the case for economic democracy, or what he called the right of workers to democracy within firms. He argued that if what we are talking about is an egalitarian order dominated by small family-owned, family-operated firms, then this whole Lockean defense of private property that is so central to American capitalism, that may have made good sense morally and politically. But he went on to say that the defense of the autonomy of private property takes on an entirely new character when it gets extended under radically changed economic circumstances to the modern corporation. So here's Dahl. Because the internal government of the corporation is not itself democratic, but hierarchical and often despotic, people in fact live out their working lives, which is to say most of their daily existence, not within a democratic system, but within a hierarchical system of subordination. And what Dahl concluded was that when it was applied to the modern industrial economy, this Lockean defense of private property was perverted because it simultaneously immunized hierarchically organized corporations from any kind of internal democratic controls, while at the same time preventing the government from imposing any such controls from without. So I think that a full analysis of our own democracy and its discontents requires that we look beyond the individual level attitudes and behaviors that figure so centrally in so much work in political science. I think it requires that we also look beyond the formal constitutional questions with which we are all, I think with justification, so preoccupied these days. I think it requires us to take a close look as well at the macro structures of our political economy that produce the kinds of economic insecurities that I've been talking about and that I believe render real democratic engagement by ordinary citizens difficult, if not impossible. It seems to me that realizing not just the procedural, but also the substantive aspirations that we attach to this concept of democracy requires that we consider the question of how to mobilize and empower citizens to give them the capacity to contest the exercise of power, not just in politics, but also in the market. Thank you.